Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? If you're enjoying the show so far, remember to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheists United Studios.
Today we are joined by ex-evangelical writer, speaker, and advocate Chrissy Stroop. She is currently a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches and a weekly columnist for Open Democracy. Her work has also appeared in Dame Magazine, Foreign Policy, the Boston Globe, Playboy, Political Research Associates, as well as peer-reviewed academic journals. She was a co-editor of the essay anthology Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church. Stroop has a PhD in modern Russian history from Stanford University. In 2019, she came out as a transgender woman and began her journey of medical transition. She joins us today from her home in Portland, Oregon. Chrissy, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chrissy, for joining us. Before we get into the issue of Christian privilege, can you tell us a little bit about your own religious background? What was your story of deconversion?
Sure, Nathan. I grew up evangelical and very much Christian nationalist before they called it that. Some evangelicals have started calling themselves that now, so they're sort of owning that, even though it was introduced as a critical term in recent years, and a very sort of specifically sociologically defined term. But we definitely mixed God and country in our way of thinking, and we believe that the United States was supposed to be obedient to God, and that meant banning abortion and not letting queer people have any rights. Also, putting prayer back in schools was one of the big rallying cries when I was a kid in the 80s, and has continued to be. Both my parents work in Christian ministries. My mom recently retired as a Christian school teacher, and I even had her for part of the day as my teacher when I was in fifth grade, because they had us kind of switch classes a few times to kind of get ready for doing that in middle school and high school. So mom was the reading teacher. That meant she was my reading teacher. But yeah, like these schools are very evangelical schools. They tend to just call themselves Christian schools or Christian academies. Many of them literally started as whites-only segregation academies, but also had this explicitly Christian mission back from those Jim Crow days and responses to the civil rights movement. So I went to a school called Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis for most of my childhood. We had weekly chapels. We said 3 pledges every day to the American flag, the Christian flag, and the Bible, in that order. Our talent shows ended with audience sing-alongs of Lee Greenwood's god-awful country hit, God Bless the USA.
No way. Wow.
No, they did.
I
swear I'm not making this up. And Dad, he's a music pastor. He will be retiring pretty soon. His last job in this area is actually in an ELCA Lutheran church. Those are like the good Lutherans, the liberal Lutherans. So he came around on lots of important stuff, but he thought he was going to be stuck working in the regular evangelical churches kind of until he could retire. But he kind of got stabbed in the back by the senior pastor and the elders at the last evangelical church he was at. So he had to do a job search. And he ended up in a mainline church, which is more an appropriate space for where he is now. Thanks in large part, I should say, to conversations like we've had over the years. So I'm going to take credit for that. At least some of the credit.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was a pretty, maybe totalizing. I mean, it's home, it's school, it's presumably church on the weekends. I
think totalizing is a very appropriate word. Some would say totalitarian, and I wouldn't necessarily object.
Right, so it's always around. There's no escaping it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a funny thing. So, I mean, some people do have even harsher, far harsher experiences of social isolation in this Christian environment than I did, because we were allowed to do some extracurricular things that brought us together with public school kids. Like, for some reason, my parents were okay with us doing like community theater sort of things, like theater programs for kids, probably because they both, have some background in like musical theater and music themselves. Um, and I even actually got to do an equity house when the summer I turned 10. I was 9 and I turned 10. And, I was raised as like a boy, everyone, saw me as a boy. I played Winthrop in The Music Man at Beef and Board's Dinner Theater in Indianapolis, and it was really fun, and I met all these theater people. So once in a while, see, I would have these windows outside of the evangelical world that other people didn't have. I also didn't have my reading super restricted. Now, this is going to sound a little bit ridiculous, but because most of the time you're in this very isolated evangelical environment, and almost all of your social contact is in that world. So church, Christian school, those are the people you mostly socialize with. And there were exceptions, I think, came in part because Dad also always did like freelance music studio work, and people that he would work with or colleagues that he had in that world would also do things like, play in the pit orchestra at the local theaters. And so that's actually how I got the audition to play Winthrop at Beef and Boards, was through my dad's friend who was in the pit orchestra. But, still pretty isolated most of the time. But reading, we could read pretty much any Newbery Award winning, like, children's novel or young adult novel. So I read things that don't exactly reinforce, this Christian worldview. Like Bridge to Terabithia was actually like huge to me as a kid. I read some other things that I probably were not really age appropriate for the age that I read them, because I just kind of could get whatever from the library. I mean, my mom, she just wanted me to read, right? And I'm like, if I read, but the Christian schools, they also participate in those. You'll get your free personal pan pizza from Pizza Hut and whatever else. Save your points, do the reading program. And I liked reading, so, and I was also kind of socially awkward and shy and living in my head as someone who didn't feel fully comfortable in their body or in their own skin. So, so I read a lot. I read like all the Beverly Cleary books, Ramona and Beezus and Henry Huggins and all that stuff. And they're like super wholesome, right? But they show this world that's outside of the little evangelical bubble. It's still a Christian normative world, but it's different. And so, and then, my grandma, my mom's mom, her parents were not, so they were like very pious United Methodists, so mainliners, but they didn't go to church necessarily every week. And then all of their kids, went cuckoo for culture wars. And this is kind of a generational thing that has actually happened in a number of American families. So, they didn't actually, my grandpa would sometimes, make a little, he didn't say a whole lot. I mean, he was kind of a quiet guy, but he might make a little offhand sort of snarky comment about all the end times and rapture and apocalypse beliefs that, the next generation, my parents' generation, my aunts and uncles were always talking about, and my parents, and my grandma, who was a fourth grade public school teacher in, this small town, this very Christian part of middle America, but still public school teacher. She got me a subscription to Ranger Rick magazine. So I started reading about evolution and stuff, and environmentalism. I became this very obnoxious little environmentalist. Like, you guys turn off the lights when you leave the room. Why don't we recycle? No, nobody in central Indiana recycled in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean,
Yeah, right.
So you had a few outlets or inlets of the world, the secular world creeping in. And at what point
and it corrupted me.
Yeah. And at what point did you become aware of it? Or was there a moment of clarity? Was it something that built very, very slowly?
It built very, very slowly. It was a weird thing to deal with. I think I had a lot of cognitive dissonance for a long time. I don't know exactly how that worked, but yeah, I mean, I was reading about evolution, and then I also had all these children's books telling me that dinosaurs were created 6,000 years ago, and they lived with humans, and these like evangelical children's books. I had those, stuff from like the Creation Research Institute and whatever, and the Christian school education. I think I started to maybe get a little cynical about some of it in middle school. We had at that point moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and we were there for about 2.5 years. My dad a little bit longer, because before that he was a music pastor at Traders Point Christian Church near Indianapolis, and this was a pretty staid, formal church service. And every time we tried something a little bit innovative, the old people would complain to the pastor, who would then chew him out about it, the head pastor, right? So I think he was ready to do something more interesting, and then he got this phone call from a guy named Ron Clarkson, who was starting what they call a church plant, in Colorado Springs under the aegis of the missionary church and evangelical denomination. And Dad didn't really particularly care about denominational affiliation or doctrine per se. But really, neither did Mom either. I mean, they weren't like hardcore Calvinists or hardcore Arminians. I think they just kind of thought, yes, this Christianity has to inform our entire lives. We read the Bible every day. We make our decisions based on reading the Bible. And the Bible is very clear, prayer in schools, no gays, no abortions, but, it's not necessarily 100% clear on, whether there's predestination for everyone and that's it, or there is some kind of free will. It's totally clear on, yes, a good Christian must vote for Republicans,
Right.
and the earth was created
Yeah.
10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's, how exactly does the Holy Spirit work?
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah.
Wait, what is
good Christians can differ about those things.
what is a plant church?
Oh, church plant is what they call it.
Yeah.
And it just means that like some church organization is creating a new church. They're sending out a church, a small group of people with some funding. They'll rent any space they can get. And if they're successful, they'll probably build a building at some point. Sometimes it's a satellite church just from like one specific mother church rather than denomination, because the church gets so big it decides to split off. But it's very much from like the church growth movement, mega church inspired sort of thing. And that's what appealed to Dad about this is, now he gets to do the hip, cool, skinny jeans church thing, which was more his style, right? So where you can do rock music and you can do kind of whatever you want, because you see, function is more important than form. And this is not your grandma's church. We're going to call the bulletin a program. We're going to be seeker sensitive. So yeah, it's that very phony sort of, we're hip and cool for Jesus, and we have all the same terrible politics as the other churches, just in a hip and cool package.
Right.
This will keep the kids. Oh, right. Why did I start to get cynical? Okay, so now I'm going to Colorado Springs.
And wait, what year is this?
This is 1993 to 1995.
Uh-huh.
So 7th and 8th grade, I'm at Colorado Springs Christian School. We actually moved there in the middle of my 6th grade year. I got to go to a public school for 1 year. And so I think this created also more cognitive dissonance.
Right.
I learned about evolution there in science class and stuff. And I had like a normal sex ed class where they showed goofy videos about how wet dreams and periods are normal. And,
Right, yeah.
not where they were like, here is this half of a Velcro heart, and here is the other half. And if you stick them together and unstick them too many times, they won't stick anymore. Which is not how sex works, and it's also not how Velcro works.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, normal sex ed, normal science class. I think I decided for a little while that I was going to be a theistic evolutionist, but that didn't really last. And then into college, honestly, I was still trying to be a young earth creationist because I was convinced basically by the Answers in Genesis people that if I wasn't, my whole faith fell apart and I wasn't ready for that.
Right.
Right. And then I wanted to stay in the public school. I'd made a couple of friends, but they said, no, now your mom has this job teaching at Colorado Springs Christian School and you have to go there. And in fact, it turns out that Christian schools demand that faculty and staff send their children there. So the only way you can really get out of it is if you are enough of a hellraiser to get expelled. And that was definitely never going to be me. I mean, I cried I think once in like 8th grade when I got a B on a science
All
test.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
they find a way to lock you in.
So
Like it's one of the things I like.
they do, and it used to be that they would give you a full tuition waiver, but now it's just also a discount with seniority, and you're already making less money, and so it's always that also makes it awkward for the teachers' kids, right? So because like these schools attract families with money, but your family doesn't have that kind of money. So they're all like, "Oh, what did you do over spring break?" We went to the movies. Oh, we went to Acapulco.
Yeah.
Like,
Wow, that's even crazier. So there's money in this. It's starting to make a lot more sense. But so, and it's also really telling that like if this stuff is available to you, whereas I'm pretty sure for secular kids there are all of these religious books available, right? You can read C.S. Lewis, and it's not a scary thing. Oh my God, my kid's reading C.S. Lewis. I should be worried. It doesn't have that sort of
I mean, I
effect.
mean, if I had kids and they were reading C.S. Lewis, I'd say, put that hack away and get yourself some real fantasy. But
Yeah, right.
that's probably just
Yeah.
me.
Right. It's just amazing they like it because it's so boring and hacky. But they like it's not like I don't know anyone who sees it as a threat. But it's also the flip side of it. It's very clear why all of that literature is a threat. It really connects to, and it makes more sense. Is that something that happened too? So when was the line? When did you finally say I'm out?
Very much, much later. But one thing that did happen in 7th grade that very much rubbed me the wrong way was, so after I had normal sex ed in 6th grade, we were taken on like a retreat day, the entire 7th grade class at Colorado Springs Christian Middle School. And the part of it that I remember the most was everybody was like sitting in these bleachers in some like multi-purpose room or gym or something at the end of the day, and they were just basically giving us this whole disinformation laden, but very much like actively guilting you kind of spiel as well. So not just the typical stuff like, oh, condoms fail all the time, condoms can't prevent the AIDS virus, diseases, pregnancy, but horrible, incurable diseases, but also they get you like this. I mean, this is the kind of purity culture mindset. I mean, you've probably heard about the chewed gum and whatever, but then there's also this kind of stuff, which is a real mindfuck, which is anything that you do with a boyfriend or girlfriend that you wouldn't do with somebody else's husband or wife is cheating on your future spouse and their future spouse. So be very careful what you do with anyone of the opposite sex that you like, because if you like kiss that person and then you don't marry them, you have cheated on your future spouse and their
Wow.
future spouse.
That is
Right.
weird.
And so they lay on all this heavy, heavy guilt and manipulation. And then, they ask us all to come down and take one of those purity pledges. And we all have to go off and sit by ourselves. And in my memory, they're playing this very like heartstrings pulling sort of schmaltzy, like, make you feel bad, make you think about God kind of churchy music. And I don't know if that really happened or not. But that kind of manipulative music, I mean, it's absolutely used in church services and altar calls and stuff like that. But in any case, we had to go sit prayerfully by ourselves. And then, you're supposed to sign this pledge, but only if you really mean it. But I'm
Yes.
thinking, okay, what if I don't really mean it? What if I don't sign the pledge? Are you going to kick me out of school? We don't know. Is this a real choice? This is not a real choice. And so I agreed with the theology, right? I was like, okay, yes, I understand. God wants marriage to be between one man and one woman, and God thinks that's the only place that sex is okay, and everywhere else it's dirty. But in that context, it can be super sexy. They
Mm.
also want you to be able to like turn it on and off like a switch
Yes.
like that. Like
Yes.
stay away as far away as possible until you're married, and then suddenly it's supposed to be wonderful.
Yeah.
Nothing works that
Yep.
way.
Yeah.
But
Right.
so of course you sign the pledge, but that just leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth. And not because I disagreed with the theology, but because I disagreed with the methods and the manipulation. And I was like, why are the Christians that I'm around, all the time, why are they constantly so manipulative? This really bugs me. If we really have the truth, what are we so afraid of? And that was a question that I thought about a lot as I got into high school, and we moved back to Indiana. I graduated from Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis. And, what happened there was something that just very typically happens in evangelical churches, actually, is that, the pastor got on a power trip and he was very demanding and manipulative and just like, making ridiculous like demands on people, or just being really like controlling and micromanaging. And so my dad and the youth pastor, who was also from Indiana, they wrote, I suppose, a sort of strongly worded letter to the missionary church organization. But it would also be very vague because evangelicals are never very specific. They'll talk about like the elder was, being unchristlike in the way or the senior pastor is being unchristlike in the way he you abused his power, but they won't tell you what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
But anyway, like this kind of bad blood sort of thing is very common in evangelical churches. Like tensions happen, factions happen, falling outs happen. And so they went and started their own church plant back in north central Indiana, in Fishers, a north suburb of Indianapolis, which is mostly where I grew up. And so that too, then kind of you get to see some of how the sausage is made there when you're a kid of someone who's like a staff pastor. Like it's not only senior pastors' kids who see the stuff and get kind of fucked up by it.
Yeah. Is there a lot of church hopping
So
like that though for other people, or are they generally stable?
I'm sure I don't have any statistics on this, and I'm sure your mileage may vary, but turnover is pretty common. And obviously, some charismatic pastors manage to become sort of very domineering figures, and basically their ministries and their churches are defined by them for decades, right? But in a lot of other cases, there is infighting is pretty frequent. People get stabbed in the back, or a church just decides they're going to oust their pastor, or churches split. Like, and it may just be a personality thing.
Wow.
It's not gonna it doesn't have to be over. Did Adam have a belly button or not? And it can be very vicious and ugly because everyone's like to the other side. You're not being Christ-like.
Yeah. Wow.
No, you're not. It's the Spider-Man meme, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So was there kind of a turning point for you where like a sort of a moment where you decided that you couldn't believe this anymore?
Yeah, that didn't happen until I was about 21, and I was in my third year of college at Ball State University studying abroad. And
you had to get
I
really
had
far
been
away,
having
huh?
a lot of like severe doubts about it from the time I was 16 for sure. And I mean, it also just seeing that church plant that we then started in Indiana fall apart, and some of the ugliness that happened there, like the woman who like did managed the money and took the tithes and stuff, accused my dad of sort of like sinking the project or not having enough faith in it because he wasn't paying a full 10% of his salary as a tithe back to the church, which he felt like he could not afford to do. Working in ministry, like you're not making the kind of money that
and they know how much he's
people with
making.
comparable skills and education. Yeah, both my parents had master's degrees, by the way, both from Ball State University. I went to their alma mater for my undergrad, and so they also didn't really have a problem with that because that's where they had their like conversion experiences to get more serious about Jesus than their parents had been, with the National Christian Student Foundation and its campus house there. But yeah, so it was a long, protracted, painful thing for me. Yeah, that was when I told myself, okay, I can't be evangelical anymore. I can't believe all this stuff. Literally, I don't believe in a young earth. I tried really hard. I did everything I could to stay in the fold because I'm not a natural rebel, believe it or not. I didn't want to rock the boat with my family religiously and politically. But my convictions, were shifting as I got more information. And so finally, yeah, I determined that to myself. I could probably find the exact date that happened in my journal from that period. But in any case, it was the summer of, around about 2002. Yeah. And I got home and I kind of told one of my like high school friends about that, just kind of feeling out how she might respond. And it did not go well. And, I mostly sat on that with family and friends after that. I kind of just dissimulated. It got very uncomfortable. Sometimes I might post something on Facebook, later when Facebook came along, I started posting a lot of stuff about, more liberal and progressive politics but without like saying I'm not a Christian anymore. But sometimes I'd post something about, like how Christian schools produce extremists, or they have a bunch of like extremists in them. And then my mom would get really mad at me, and then I would like cry and take it all back, like, okay, Mom, I need Jesus. Because I just did not, like, I didn't want to hurt my mom. And the thing is, like, they make you feel like if you change your mind, you are a traitor to your family, to your community. You've forgotten where you come from. It's this whole largely internalized, manipulative defensive mechanism to keep people in the fold. It's a terrible thing to do to someone, to tell them that basically if you make any decisions on the basis of your own moral autonomy, where you don't 100% agree with your family and your community about religion and politics, you are, somehow betraying them. It's terrible to make people feel that way. But that's how you feel just growing up in this environment. I mean, even with the little windows that I had to see what was going on outside of it, still felt that way.
Right. But now when you address that, like when you post things aimed at those people, you're saying, the opposite. You're saying get away from the church, right?
Well, yeah.
That's a big change.
I did create the hashtag empty the pews in 2017, and we used it as the title of an essay anthology. I'm not like a prescriptive evangelical atheist. I don't go around trying to convert anyone to atheism, but I will tell people, I at least not usually individually. I don't really like to do that sort of thing, but publicly, yeah. I mean, I'm like, look, if you're in a church where they're using the theology to be bigoted and so forth, like, I think you should get out of that church. You should go home and rethink your life. Whether you end up in a more inclusive and humane church, different religion, spiritual but not religious, or you go all the way to agnosticism or atheism, I'm not going to tell you what you should do there. And that doesn't really even help anyone, I don't think. You have to walk your own path. So I'm not out here to like do numbers grubbing for atheists. I had to do enough numbers grubbing for Christians growing up.
But so what was the response to that in 2016, 2017 when you start the hashtag empty the pews? What was the feedback you got from people going through what presumably you had felt years earlier?
It was August 2017. I was kind of hoping at the time, and this was after Charlottesville, right after the Unite the Right rally, and Donald Trump saying, "Oh, there are very fine people on both sides." Yeah. Right. So there's very fine Nazis and Confederates, and very fine people who want to tear down statues. Yeah. So I was thinking about how like leading evangelical voices didn't say anything to oppose this. They were either silent about it or they went to bat for him. Like Robert Jeffress, of First Baptist Dallas, whose choir did that infamous "Make America Great Again" hymn.
Oh,
like it was so awful. I don't know if you remember that, but Google that. Yeah, it's terrible. But anyway, Jeffress, went on Pat Robertson's network, CBN, and was basically saying Trump doesn't have a racist bone in his body. How dare these liberals all call him racist just because he said there's very fine people on both sides or whatever. Like, he literally said he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. And so this was, making me mad. And I was also just kind of thinking about how it's so annoying that evangelicals never really respond to their critics, unless sometimes they feel like they have to maybe respond to internal critics. They just ignore you. They just shut you out. So I thought, the one thing that they are afraid of, they've always been afraid of, and they have more and more reason to be afraid of it now, is losing the youth. So I created this hashtag empty the pews to try to throw that in their faith in their face, but also their faith.
Great pun.
Yeah. I didn't even do that on purpose by a little bit with the medicine brain, but it works, I guess. So I was kind of hoping that maybe people would adopt that, and there would be stories of people leaving their churches right now, but it was mostly people who responded who had already kind of decided that Trump was the last straw for them, or they'd left a little bit before, and they started sharing stories though, and it did go viral, and for a while it was kind of a sort of community signifying hashtag on Twitter that had some real staying power there. It's just sort of a low, background kind of staying power for, and trended a few times for several years.
Wow.
I didn't necessarily expect that. And I also clarified quickly as I saw, at that time, I wasn't even calling myself an atheist. I was very insistently calling myself an agnostic, and getting really mad at the atheists who are like, well, that really means you're an atheist, which also is a stupid semantic argument that you should never have with anyone. So all of you atheists out there who love to dunk on that one, stop it. You're not helping anything. But, let people self-identify, for the love of Captain Crunch, man. But, yeah, so I was like, look, this hashtag can be for you if you're still a Christian too. It can be for anybody who has abandoned this kind of church. We should all talk to each other. We all have things in common. We came from this really awful fundamentalist, racist, sexist background. We should deconstruct these things. We should compare notes. We shouldn't be at odds because you ended up in, the ELCA Lutheran church and I don't go to church anymore. And more broadly, as I came to think of that over the last several years, I've come to express it as, also just politically, we need coalitions built around shared values. That's a lot more important than shared beliefs, I think. Some beliefs obviously are more problematic than others, but also everyone holds contradictory beliefs. And if you say you don't, you're probably lying. I don't know.
So tell us, how did this?
I just don't think that humans are perfectly rational machines. We just aren't.
Right. And so do we see that in the essays of the book? I want the audience to have a better idea of what it looked like, what the responses looked like. Is it a lot of people who feel this way? Like, yeah, I've left the church, but I found another that's better aligns with my values. Or is it are there also people in there who are like, you know what, I'm done with it. This is too much. I don't feel it anymore.
Well, the book is mostly people who became atheists, with a few exceptions. Who are sort of like, I'm sort of maybe coming back to Jesus, or I still like Jesus, but I don't go to church, or I'm spiritual but not religious now. But it's mostly people who ended up atheists. And that was a deliberate editorial choice because, there were some books coming out about the nuns then that were really just highlighting how, so many of these nuns still have all these spiritual and religious beliefs.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
see? And I'm like, there's nothing wrong with secularization. There's nothing wrong with being an atheist. Fuck you all for the narratives you're trying to construct around. America's not really secularizing. They just don't like our right-wing churches.
Yes. Right, yes.
I guess I do have a kind of contrarian side, well, at least with those kinds of mainstream narratives that really bug me. So I wanted to make a deliberate choice to highlight people who were like, no, I'm done with this. No more religion for me. And that's mostly what it is. And even though, I'm not an anti-theist, and I think anti-theism is mostly counterproductive, the last essay in the book is pretty much an anti-theist essay. It's by Isaac Marion. It's very, very good, I have to say. It's very powerful. And it's not something I would ever write myself, because I would never be comfortable writing something so overtly anti-religious. But I'm glad it exists, and I think that people should listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just moving to the practical question of Christian nationalism, I want to ask about what do Christian nationalists actually care about, I guess? Because there's this sort of paradox of Trump of obviously he's not a good Christian and so on, and
he is according to Liberty University.
Right. Jesus. So I wonder what do they care about exactly? Do they actually care about things like abortion, or is that just sort of a front for something else that they care about more deeply?
That's an interesting question. I do think there's sort of multiple layers of things going on there, right? I remember really sincerely believing phenomenologically that abortion was murder. And so that was actually very hard to let go, because they drill this into your head from the time you're 5 years old, or as soon as you can remember. There are all these liberals out there and they kill babies and we have to stop them. Oh my God. We can't say, oh my God, obviously, but they're killing babies. My stars. What can we do about this? it's just drilled into your head that this is a fact, and it becomes very hard to deconstruct it in light of all the sort of actual pertinent scientific facts about natal development and so forth, and and how many fertilized eggs just don't implant or whatever. Well, God's allowed to decide to kill them, right?
Yes, yes.
Like, no, I mean, the whole idea, of course, of
Right.
fetal personhood
Yes.
is absolutely absurd and pernicious. But I had to kind of get there by steps, and first I was just voting. I stopped being a one issue voter,
Mm.
right? The first election I could vote in was 2000, George W. Bush versus Al
Oh
Gore,
God. Yeah.
and I voted for Bush because of the abortion issue, nothing else. And then in 2004, I voted for John Kerry, but I had not actually been able to convince myself that abortion was not murder, just that it wasn't the highest priority or the only thing I should vote based on. I mean, look, okay, let's say it's murder. So is all this killing of civilians we're
In
doing over
Iraq.
in Iraq.
I know.
Torture is also bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it sounds like it worked,
um,
right? Like that even if it's whether or not there's a very earnest belief about stopping abortion, which it may be, it also does have an influence in turning people into a single issue voter. And it sounds like
it
that
does
worked
do
on
other
you.
work for them, quite a bit of other work for them. And I think anytime that you bring up children, this children work very well for moral panics. They
Mm-hmm.
function very neatly
Mm.
as a kind of Lacanian defensive fetish.
Mm.
And for people who haven't read Lacan, I mean, what I mean by that is you can bring this up to make yourself sound reasonable, to use as a defense mechanism if you don't want to change your mind about something, or you don't want people to think you're a bigot. Like, oh, I have nothing against people dressing in drag in the privacy of their own home, but children,
Yeah.
we must protect the
Right.
Right.
children.
We've heard that
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a well, it's a classic pattern. We've
Right.
seen this movie
Mhm.
many
Yeah.
times, and if you go
Yes.
back to the 1980s and the Satanic Panic,
Right.
Mhm.
the rallying cry was, "We believe the children." But they didn't believe the children. Like, if you think about the McMartin preschool case and all the other like massive cases of supposed satanic ritual abuse happening at daycares, right? They sat these children down with psychologists who were working directly with the police and asking them leading questions. These children are like 3, sometimes a little older, in some cases maybe even a little younger, and they're like, "So, when did Mr. Jones touch you, and where did he touch you?
Oh wow.
You know,
Jesus. Yeah.
when did Mr. Jones boil a baby while reciting a satanic prayer?" I mean,
Yeah.
eventually, like, you know, the kids figure out that first of all, they sort of think they're playing a game, right? And I mean, there's a wonderful book about this that really goes into the details on how the psychology of this was so bad, and it was all caught up too in the recovered memory therapy, which is so dubious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so they didn't believe the kids until the kids told them what they wanted to hear, which was that, oh yeah, one time, Mrs. Smith boiled a baby and made us eat it.
Yeah.
The whole
Right. Yeah.
FBI task force was devoted to this stuff. That was never happening. There was no physical evidence of any of it. In some cases, there may have actually been, someone molested a child in the context of these daycares. I mean, I'm sure that has happened many, many times. But they didn't go about getting the evidence in a responsible way. They did definitely put innocent people in prison. One of the people who did, by the way, one of the big prosecutors at that time, Janet Reno, she was vicious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Makes sense.
do not think she was a good person. Like, sorry, Bill Clinton administration, but I don't.
Yeah.
But
No, I think we knew that then. But then again, to that point, like it was the same thing at Waco, right? It was, but think of the children, and then more recently,
yeah.
right? And then more
And I
recently,
mean, maybe I have a little more sympathy with it in that case, but
yeah,
still, Waco was mishandled.
yeah.
Obviously, was
But
mishandled.
then Rocket Pizza, it's the same story, right? Now it's like they're grooming. It's a secret code on the pizza. That's how you get to the children being held in the basement, and it sounds like the exact same playbook, right? Where
It's
now
come back around.
groomers and
Children work
and drag brunches.
Children work really, really well when you want to foment a moral panic in order to control people. So, and I think it's very telling when abortion and the current, Christian right narrative of abortion really comes into its own. It's not 1973 and 1974, right after the Roe decision is actually handed down by the Supreme Court. It's more 1978, 79, 80. It's the late 70s when Weyrich and Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell Sr., really decide that, okay, this is gonna work. And what's happening in that context? Same thing as that famous quote about the Southern strategy. You start by saying the N word, but then that hurts you by 1970, so you have to say something else, right? So they were losing the battle on, racial segregation. Late 70s, what's going on? The Bob Jones case, right? And can they still refuse to admit black students, or can they still ban interracial dating and keep their federal funding? Remarkably, eventually, sometime in the early 80s, they'd have to look up the exact date. I mean, they actually lost the case, right? So they turned to abortion, which a lot of people then, of course, sincerely, I think, start to believe, and they inculcate it. They indoctrinate their children to believe this. And so many of us grew up, I think, very sincerely believing, a fetus is a person, it has a soul. It's like that Monty Python song, every sperm is sacred, almost. But at the same time, this kind of serves as a way to help them maintain white supremacist patriarchal politics without having to seem like bigots. So it is the but the children deflection, the but the children defensive fetish comes into play here. It lets them keep their whole complex of political policies that uphold white supremacist patriarchy, while they can claim that, they just love black people. And in fact, as you know, most abortions happen with black women, and it's black genocide. They can really twist the rhetoric that way.
Yeah,
so.
In inner cities and all that. So one of the things, the way this,
which, as we all know, are just terrible, terrible places. In fact, my apartment's on fire right now, and there's tear gas outside.
Because of Antifa running, they've killed all the police, and
Yep. There's no more police in Portland.
Right.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, New York City is much safer than Louisiana, but let's not look into that too much. I think it's not Mitch McConnell. Mike McCarthy's home district is one of the most dangerous for gun violence in the U.S. It's great, and it's votes red because, of course. But I think one of the things that you've written about, is how the language around this has also shifted recently, and the tactic now has come under things that liberals do support, and even atheists support, which is ideas of religious freedom and tolerance, right? So how do we, when we say it, we have certain expectations, right? Well, you're free to practice your religion in a way you think is fit. Tolerance is that if it doesn't affect me, you should be allowed to do it. And I need to respect that. But you're saying this isn't really what's going on. This is actually cover for Christian privilege. So how do we, what is that meaning? What's buried there? And how does this disguise Christian privilege? And how ought we understand this?
I mean, Christian privilege is something that operates sort of independently of this particular strategy, but this has been an effective strategy of the last few decades to reclaim the term religious freedom to basically mean that conservative Christians get to do whatever they want, and they keep using this same playbook. And someone who's written a lot about this very good stuff for Political Research Associates, but also elsewhere, is Fred Clarkson. So I would recommend reading his stuff. But Republicans and conservative Christians, especially evangelicals, they start screaming that it's a violation of my religious freedom when I have to give someone when I'm a pharmacist and I have to fill a prescription for birth control or the abortion pill, which may actually be banned very soon, or hormones for trans people. That's under a traditional understanding of what religious freedom is and how to navigate and manage pluralism in a complex pluralistic democracy. This is a clear example of equal accommodation in the public square, right? You go to a pharmacy with the decision to be between you and your doctor. No one at that pharmacy should be putting their religious beliefs on you. You go to the pharmacy, you get your prescription. if the pharmacist won't give you the prescription, um, then there should be someone there who will, and no one should shame you. That's equal accommodation in the public square. They've completely flipped that on its head and said, no, it is a violation of that pharmacist's religious beliefs. How dare you? You're so intolerant. So much for the tolerant left.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's a classic example. We could also talk about gay wedding cakes, or any number of other kinds of cases. Even the more recent Supreme Court cases that they've used to carve out, they getting funding for education, that wasn't meant to go to. It's like federal funding that wasn't meant to go into religious programs, because that's a clear violation of separation of church and state. They started to get access to that sort of thing, or they started to make it to where, if you have a scholarship in your state, that is not supposed to be used at private or religious schools, well, you can't do that anymore. Now they have to have access to this fund as well. And then we've also been seeing this creeping in through the decades now, with voucher funding, right? So voucher funding for, if you don't want to send your kid to the public schools, the local school, the local government will still give you some money that you can that it would have maybe spent on your kids if they went to the public school. So you can now take it and spend it in private school, or to fund your homeschooling, which in most states, no one ever checks what you do. Some states have requirements on paper that they should, but no enforcement mechanisms. And that's also been a part of this playbook since the 1980s. I always like to say that, the single most important Christian right lobbying group that you've never heard of is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And I think people should be much more aware of HSLDA than they are, because they've been winning Supreme Court cases since the 1980s, deregulating homeschooling to such an extreme degree that, in the state of California, you can just register your address as a school and no one ever checks on what you're doing. It turns out sometimes what you're doing is chaining your children to beds and making them memorize Bible verses.
Right.
And that's a real example from actual news.
Wow. Yeah.
On the Christian privilege issue, do you think that atheists in some way, or former Christians, do they share in this Christian privilege in some way, or do they help to continue it, or whatever?
I think sometimes atheists do. I think that if you are an atheist from a Christian background, there are some extra things that you sort of some layers that you need to work on unpacking with where you come from, or you'll end up replicating some of these same patterns. And I mean, atheists can perpetuate Christian privilege in a couple of ways. Sometimes you'll find atheists who get really defensive about Jesus, right? Like, I don't understand those guys. I think sometimes they're just like, Jesus was a working class hero, leave him alone, man. But but sometimes they'll join in with the like, oh, but a real Christian, like the No True Scotsman, a real Christian would not want to ban abortion or control women or do whatever. That's annoying. But also I think that, sometimes we just replicate the same patterns, but with a different ideological veneer over the top. So, if we come out of a European Christian context historically, and so obviously I'm including the sort of, Neo-Europe's British Imperial Commonwealth, whatever, Australia, US, Canada, we're a part of this too, right? This sort of European historical context of Christianity being very much one of the key sort of justifications for colonization, and very much embedded in colonization, and all the missionary efforts that went, the white with the white man's burden, and that sort of thing. I think that colonialist mindset is very kind of deeply internalized by people who come from a white European Christian background, and sometimes we don't unpack that. We think, oh, I stopped believing all the stupid religious stuff. Now I'm a good person and I never have to think again. Which is obviously not something that Richard Dawkins would say, but I would argue that his behavior sort of looks that way to me.
Yeah.
I mean, when you are as wealthy and powerful and famous as him, and you spend months going after a kid who got arrested in school, a little Muslim boy, because he built a clock and he wanted to show it to his teacher. And because this was Texas, all the white people were like, it's a bomb. And it was just a little Muslim boy going to school with a clock he built. And Richard Dawkins, berates him and says he just wants attention, and why do we need to, have any legal redress for this? This is, the parents are just trying to get money now. And by the way, Muslims have won very few Nobel Prizes.
Oh,
I mean,
Jesus. Right.
this is colonialism, and it's shaped in a Christian context. No matter if you decide you're not a Christian anymore, you're being prescriptive as to what everyone should be, and you're showing the same bias.
It's still performing
and
it's
yeah, like I said,
normalizing certain behaviors and expectations.
right.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very sort of Protestant, especially, but also Catholic thing too, to demand that people all should believe the same way in order to be good members of the community, right?
Yeah.
So the drive to do street epistemology, to convert people, or just to be like, we're smarter and we're superior to you. I mean, what's more Calvinist than that? Because of what we believe, we're superior to you.
But okay,
So I think,
when you put it that way, one of the things that it makes me think of is kind of the expectation, even that, you mentioned it, the way people practice a religion, right? Like we kind of expect, well, on Sunday you go to church and then you go home and you live the rest of your life that way. And we kind of, definitely as atheists, I think we can kind of, one of the things we bring to it is like, you wall that part off, right? Like, of course, when you're at work, you do your job and you block off the religious part because that's private. And of course, that's not how religion works, right? That's not the way it is for most religions. It just happens to be the way a lot of religion is expected to be here.
And that's a fair point.
Yeah. And we kind of see that. I mean, like in something like, and this example has come up, the way like Biden was sort of made news for a while because he supports abortion. He doesn't get abortion. He thinks it should be legal. And as president, he's kind of working towards that, trying to keep it legal. And I remember there being a big to-do about this in the press about him being, whether or not he should take communion. And that was a big story, and it went around. But then I didn't even know that Rick DeSantis is also Catholic.
Oh, you mean Ron DeSantis?
I'm sorry, Rick. There's so many Ricks in Florida. Rick Scott and
Rick Scott, Ron DeSantis.
They blend together. But like DeSantis, also Catholic, has overseen the execution of people, which is, using state power to kill people, much the way Pontius Pilate did. And I've never heard any connection between like whether or not he should take. Yeah. So like why is communion?
So which bishops or which, sort of Catholic stance should be the one that bars people from taking communion?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the whole thing is total bullshit, because bishops should stay out of it. I mean, your political beliefs are not the same necessarily as like you going to take someone to get an abortion or something, right? Which I'm not saying they should bar you from communion for that, but if they were going to, in theory, Joe Biden's just arguing about pragmatically, it's not necessarily what I believe, but it needs to be legal for these reasons. How that's like a whole layer removed, and how is that fair to say, hey, he shouldn't take communion? But anyway. So yeah, there's a total double standard there, though, and I would argue that the Christian right, Catholics and Protestants, have very effectively helped engineer this double standard in our mind over the years. That when we're talking about, it's the same double standard that we see in religious freedom rhetoric. When it comes to whose religion matters in the public square, it's only the fundamentalists, it's only the right wingers. They're the ones who need to be protected. So they imagine all of these absolutely like ridiculous scenarios. They imagine that they're going to be arrested for refusing to perform a same-sex wedding, which is not something anyone would ever make a policy like. But they've also been imagining these catastrophic situations since the early Cold War. America's going to go commie, and the commies are going to come for you and test your faith, and they'll kill you if you don't deny Christ. There's even this really terrible Ray Boltz music video from the 1980s called "I Pledge Allegiance to the Lamb," that has this like little like dramatic vignette in it with this father. It turns out he's been arrested for his Christian faith,
Oh my God.
and he's telling his son to like carry on, like yeah. So they have argued, and I think most of the time they're not arguing this in good faith. I mean, again, layers of beliefs and what effects they have, and where is false consciousness, and what do you really believe? I don't know. I would say that certainly going by their behaviors, power and control and domination are at the core of the things that they fixate on. Sincere beliefs can absolutely be factoring into that too, but yeah, so they imagine this scenario. They throw it out there as if this is a good faith argument. Well, what if pastors start getting arrested for refusing to perform same-sex marriages? And so they get us all to think, oh, well, we better be really careful to protect religious freedom so that no one has to do a gay wedding. And meanwhile, there are Christian pastors out there who want to make sure that in their denomination they're allowed to perform same-sex weddings. We don't care about their religious freedom. Their religious freedom is, not the tiniest blip on the public's radar screen. It's just not there.
Yeah. So who controls
and
this
so religious
narrative?
freedom, it's supposed to be this. I mean, that's the funny thing, right? There's not like a conspiracy of people sitting around controlling it.
Well, I mean,
but,
CBN is kind of the council of what's the Baptist Council?
You mean the SBC, the
Yes.
Southern Baptist Convention?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, a lot of them believe very conspiracy, and they were caught in a conspiracy, right, to suppress sexual abuse cases, just like the Catholic Church was.
Yeah. But the SBC did have there was a leadership coup a couple decades ago, and their plan was to move the church as far to the right as possible, and they did it.
Oh, that is correct. I mean, you can say that was a conspiracy too. Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson get together at Café du Monde in New Orleans, eating beignets, and write down on a napkin the plan to take Baptist institutions over and they do it, and it really happened. But it's like in Southern Baptist circles, that's like a holy myth now. It's this whole thing with their legends, and they've also been caught. Well, one of them is credibly accused of molesting young boys, and the other was caught on tape saying that women should just tolerate it when their husbands abuse them and just pray more and try to get them to church and repent,
Wow.
And that's sort of just downplaying abuse and downplaying sexual assault. And so that's who they are, and that's why they did what they did. But yeah, they did, carry out a very successful coup. It was a kind of long-term coup between the mid to late 70s, and it was pretty complete by 1994. To take over all Southern Baptist institutions for conservatives. And so you still have this funny situation in the 1990s where Bill Clinton is a Southern Baptist, right? But they hate him. Right. And they have made sure that people like him and like Jimmy Carter can no longer have any influence in Southern Baptist institutions.
Right.
A lot of people were fired from Southern Baptist colleges and universities and seminaries who were too liberal or who were too female. I'm not even making that up, right? You can't have women teaching men in the Southern Baptist Church. That's just wrong.
Wow. But Chrissy, how do we undo this? Is there an easy way, or is there any way where this can be walked back? Where are there the successful cases of people recognizing this sort of Christian privilege, seeing through it, and then devising ways to reassert either individual rights or just appropriate behavior? When have we ever seen that?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't think that we have really talked about Christian privilege very much. I think it has flown under the radar for a long time, and so I'm not sure that we've really successfully walked it back. I mean, obviously, in terms of civil rights in general, there have been better periods and worse periods, and if you want to kind of look at the history of what the sort of back and forth history of Western, what used to be called, republicanism or democracy. I mean, like the French republics, right? Like periods of, ascendancy of Republican ideals, or also the, kinds of ideals of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine. They would have called them Republican ideals back in those days. Little R Republican. They once when they make some gains, then they get pushed back, right? So we're in this moment of backlash. for sure. But I do think that one important means of going ahead when we're talking about a lot of other, aspects of how privilege functions in society without us necessarily having thought about it, how it kind of just gets baked into our social systems, particularly thinking about, intersectionality theory, Kimberly Crenshaw's idea that she first had back in the 1980s, and how we've all started from that, to think more about things like white privilege and male privilege and straight privilege. We need to add Christian privilege to that list and start to also call it out where we see it happening. I think we got to try to dismantle those things across the board if we're going to work toward equality. And I also think that, as atheists, we have to be able to extend respect if we also want to be respected. So not saying, don't be cognizant of the fact that we are stigmatized, that we're still like the least electable demographic or whatever. A lot of people don't trust atheists because, oh no, they can't swear on anything sacred, which is a dumb reason to trust people in the first place. I mean, I cite all of history as my evidence. But, we've got to start working on every front. And I think that it is counterproductive for us to alienate religious people that we can work with, who are willing to extend that same respect to us. But sometimes with those people, you do have, like with liberal Christians, you do have to stand up and point out to them where they're acting based on unacknowledged Christian privilege. Where they may be, saying something that just paints Christianity in this magical, special, more moral than anything else sort of light, or that denigrates atheism. A lot of people make these comments offhand and not even think about them. I think we can push back on that, because while extending respect, we also need to demand to be respected. And I also think it's interesting that, the upcoming generation, Gen Z, and is the least religious generation in the United States ever. This is quite remarkable. And I believe also the most queer. And that's not a coincidence. As queerness has gained more visibility, more people have had the sort of permission to think about things related to their identity that they couldn't before, that they simply would have hidden before. And this information, it's kind of out of this information genie is out of the bottle, right? And you can't put it back in. America is secularizing, but so younger secular kids, they want a different kind of secular advocacy than, what new atheism was and what much of secular advocacy still is. They want an issues-based advocacy that actually thinks about things like equality in the public square, that writes us into the narrative of religious freedom, that sees queer advocacy as essential to secular advocacy, because who's oppressing the queer people? Well, it's mostly Christians.
Yeah.
Right. It's not all of them. Hashtag not all, but
there are good folks on both sides, Chrissy. One of the things that we learned,
what they don't want to do. Let me just say what they don't want to do is hire billboards that say "There's no God," or like "Get over yourself, there's no God," or whatever.
I know it's amazing because it's all the things that are the traditional angry atheist talking points are at the bottom of their list. It's all like you talk about young atheists. It's all like the environment, queerness, having jobs and universal health care. And at the very bottom, it's like having "In God We Trust" on the money removed, prayer in school. It's not where their head's at.
I do think we should get rid of "In God We Trust" and all that. That stuff really bugs me. I would argue that it's maybe more important than we think. But yeah, I mean, those other things I would also say they are higher priority. But the kids give me hope. And I think that we are in a moment where we can start really thinking about Christian privilege and analyzing it. And it's not really a term that's been out there much before, but I am trying to put it out there, and I will be friends forever with anybody else who wants to join me in just throwing the term out there as much as possible. So we make it a concept that the public can't ignore. And I mean, back to your question of who controls the narrative. Well, there's no one group of people who controls the narrative, but there are gatekeepers. And, the media, by and large, elite outlets, cable news outlets, they're running scared of offending any large group of American Christians, right? They kind of have to have their hand forced, and they're also just operating from a place where they really don't know. I mean, so you talk about coastal elites, right? People who didn't grow up around evangelicals. They're most of the people deciding who gets to write about evangelicals, who gets to do the reporting. A lot of times in major media outlets, and this is very much an expression of Christian privilege, evangelicals get to cover themselves. The respectable ones get to paint themselves in a positive light. Um, we never talk about how, like, a lot of the elite commentators on evangelicalism in America or religion in America, elite journalists, like people at the New York Times and the Washington Post, um, many of them went to the same evangelical university, Wheaton College, right in Illinois. Um, Michael Gerson did way back when. Um, Elizabeth Diaz graduated from Wheaton. Sarah Pulliam Bailey graduated from Wheaton. So evangelicals have kind of sold to editors, I think, this idea that, oh, the public is really biased against us. They're just so mean. So you need to let us set the record straight with our unbiased, fair, and balanced journalism. And the editor's like, well, you're the only evangelical I know, so okay, I believe you. You know, and somehow the rest of us who grew up this way and now are very critical of it are written off as just these, losers with an axe to grind or something. That needs to change. The only way to change that is to, keep demanding it and keep calling out Christian privilege. So the newspapers, and the cable news networks, I mean, they absolutely perpetuate Christian privilege, and they do a lot to set the narrative, not out of, like, the cabal gets together, and sets the agenda, but simply out of self-censorship and internalized systemic practices and unacknowledged beliefs that they don't even think about. They need, they don't have self-reflection about what's internalized. That's how privilege works, right? And that's why we need to start reflecting on it and hope that leads to changed practices and changed narratives.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of changing narratives, Chrissy, we need to think about what true atheists can and cannot do. Are you ready for the lightning round? Because
oh, you bet I was born ready.
This is fantastic. Because if we're going to change minds and we're going to start calling out I already forgot. This is terrible. If we're going to start calling out Christian privilege, step 1, remember what it is. Step 2, call it out. We need to identify who the true atheists are. So we need to know right away. So there's no wrong answer. It's a yes or no question, but you can elaborate on your point. So let's start off with an easy one. Can a true atheist believe in God?
According to sociological surveys, yes, but I will actually say no to that one, because I do think it's actually sort of like the definition. You can be not sure if God exists. In fact, I think that's a better, more scientific position than being sure that God does not exist.
Chrissy, I think that's an agnostic. I think that's what you really mean.
You can't actively believe in. No. I mean, what I just said was, I think it's a perfectly good summary of, like, Carl Sagan's position, mm-hmm. right? Carl Sagan was like, I don't believe in God because I haven't seen any compelling evidence for the existence of God, but I cannot with certainty state that there is no God. Right? That's where I want to be. Yeah. We had good atheists before we had cranky atheists. We had Carl Sagan, and then we had Richard Dawkins. Like, what happened? Anyway.
Carl Sagan died. Okay. How's that for proof that God doesn't exist?
Carl Sagan did, like, really important advocacy too. He was against the H-bomb and stuff, and he was for nuclear arms reduction. He thought a lot about the Cold War. What did Richard Dawkins do? He wrote a few books, and then he started yelling at little Muslim boys.
Nathan?
Okay.
Sorry. I got a few axes to grind. I see
that. Okay. The next one. Can a true atheist think religion should be eradicated from the world?
Ooh.
Yeah, and many of them do. They're assholes, but they do. Okay. I've seen this come up. I do atheist speaking events, and then someone in the audience asks me, "Are we winning the war against organized religion?" And I'll say, well, I'm not at war with organized religion, but if you are, you're losing it. Sorry, and
Right,
that
right.
one's not winnable, my friend. You
Yeah.
know?
But if you could sort of snap your fingers and make religion disappear, like, would you do it?
No, too much human culture would be lost. Um, if I could snap my fingers and make everyone stop believing in Christian dogma, I would be very, very tempted. I see. I don't have a beef with a lot of religions. Uh, Christianity is personal.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Good
Yes.
formulation.
Yeah.
Well, with that in mind,
Yeah.
can a true atheist enjoy gospel music?
Oh, sure. I imagine many of them do. I mean, I don't know.
Do you still? I mean,
It's a
it's
thing for
you.
sure.
Your father was a music director, or very
Right.
musical.
Yeah.
Do you still go back to that music?
My father was no, and is no Bill Gaither. I mean, he's much cooler than that.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, sometimes do I still listen to gospel music? Yeah, especially black gospel once in a while. I'm more likely to listen to like older like black spirituals though, and like jazz songs with religious themes, right? Like jazz versions of like Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho. You know, it's a part of our culture. You know, and I don't know. Everyone has problematic faves, right? So I despise most contemporary Christian music, uh, but there are still some artists, and some of their old, like some of them might have also come out of that and changed, but some of their old stuff, I might still like it just because it's nostalgic and I have good memories about it, right? You know, so um, there are a few cases of that, and in particular, you know, I really like the old Christian music of Jennifer Knapp, who eventually like came out as a lesbian, and her music, she was really struggling with like clearly struggling with some of the like most awful and controlling things about Christian theology. And the lyrics are just awful. The theology of her first album, Kansas, is awful, but the artistry is like wow. And you can also just tell it's very authentic. So I can appreciate that on some level.
Yeah.
And that's the
On another
opposite of
note,
most contemporary Christian
yeah,
music. Most of it is slick and formulaic and has no authenticity at all. You
right.
know.
Yes, yes,
Don't listen to
I'm
that
sorry, I
stuff.
have many
Yes.
opinions.
yeah. All right. Can a true atheist eat animals?
Oh yeah, of course. Like, why is that even a question? Is there someone out there who's like atheists must be vegans? I've never met that person.
It's a weird thing. We're trying to figure it out. We ask everybody, and surprisingly, it's incredibly common. Even Nathan and I are like, are either dropping it or eat less. It's weird. It's weird. You haven't encountered this?
No, I mean well, I haven't encountered someone who says you must be a vegan to be
Mm.
an atheist. But I mean, yes, of course you can combine vegetarianism or veganism with being an atheist, but you also can not do that and still be
Right.
an
Yeah.
atheist. That's all I'm
Yeah.
trying to say.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I've not met that prescriptive person who is like, as an atheist, you must not eat meat.
Well, Chrissy, right now, for the sake of this game, you get to be
Who
that
died and made you, Mr.
prescriptive
Spock?
Yeah,
person.
right.
You get to tell
Yes.
everyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I would eat way less meat if I were just a stronger person, and maybe someday I will.
Oh,
Because I do think that the ethics of eating, especially cows, are not great under the conditions we're in with climate change. But I still love myself a good steak.
it's all right because, well, how about
When are
this?
we gonna have these ones that they can grow in a lab from stem cells?
They do,
When are
but
we
they're
gonna get
super
stem cell
expensive
steak?
right now. That sort of
Well, right. I
that
mean, they have
beef.
to be affordable.
I know. I don't want to. Oh, now I'm getting depressed and cranky. Okay,
Sorry.
Chrissy, can a true atheist think we live in a computer simulation?
Sure. Why not? I mean, if you're certain about that, I would question as to why. But if you just raise it as a question, I'd be like, oh, just another, philosophy faculty member.
Yeah.
Just another classic American or UK analytic philosopher. Met
Yes.
those
Yeah.
guys.
Straight into solipsism.
Can a true atheist miss going to church?
Oh yeah, you can miss anything. I mean, we all have problematic faves, right? I listened to one episode recently where I believe you asked, "Can a true atheist go to church?" And the person answered yes, and I also agree with that. Like, You know, you can you. Oh, I remember. I'm remembering which one it was. Gosh, why am I forgetting his name though? But it was, famous, pretty famous in atheist circles, African American atheist who sometimes goes back to the black church, and I can very much
Chris
sympathize.
Cameron.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Cameron. Chris Cameron. I
Mhm.
knew his name, but I just sometimes it just doesn't come to me in the moment. But yeah, it was a great episode, and I mean, I can totally sympathize with just going back to something that's so important to your culture and formative community, and not believing in it. But I think we get very weird and precious about this with Christianity and atheism from Christian backgrounds. But uh, most Jews have no problem with the notion that you can be a practicing Jew and not believe in God. Like, just that's very common. Buddhists don't have to believe in God, but they can practice meditation and find that it has some benefits for them. So I think with Christianity and Islam, people get very, very weird about this. And Christianity, we're hyper focused on belief, especially since the Protestant Reformation, making sure everyone believes the right things. So if you don't believe, why would you do the practice? But if you step back and you just look at sort of the anthropology of religion writ large, there's a lot of, I mean, the core component of religion for most religions is not belief, it's practice, and how that ritual and practice links you to a community. And so, while I won't go to a church very often, there are times that I will go to a church service for some reason or other. Just if I want to be there in solidarity with somebody, or because my mom's like, well, you really should see your dad's Christmas Eve service. He worked so hard on that.
That's just sweet. Oh. Okay, let's step it up then. Can a true atheist be a Christian nationalist?
Yeah, I'm going to say yeah, probably.
Really?
I don't know that I've met that person, but I bet they exist. There are probably some people who don't believe. Ah, hey, who don't believe in God, but
Nice.
but they follow that politics. Or wait, how about that? Okay, remember 2014? I think it was that terrorist attack on Norwegian summer camps.
Yeah.
Anders
Yeah.
Breivik, that guy, mass murderer.
Yeah.
He very much defined himself as a Christian atheist, right?
Did he?
And why was he killing liberal youth in political? Yeah, in his manifesto,
Right. Wow.
in like liberal political camps, was because they were like multicultural and they were adopting multicultural beliefs, and therefore they were destroying Norwegian civilization and Christian civilization, right? So that was his actual like stated motivation for his crimes, for his mass shooting. So he was an atheist Christian nationalist. Yes, they exist. Because he also said he doesn't believe in God, but that Christianity is a part of European culture and our civilization. And I think on the alt-right, you probably also would find a lot of people who post their like Crusader, like Deus Vult memes or whatever and don't believe in God.
You know what? I think all of those answers were correct, Chrissy. Fantastic. Congratulations.
Yeah, pass the test.
Thanks. So with that, Chrissy, anything that you want to plug? Any upcoming events, and how should people find you? Let's take that step by step.
Thanks. Well, yeah. All right. Well, I'll start with the last one. I'm still pretty active, fairly often on Twitter, even though Twitter is a total clusterfuck now. So Thanks for that, Elon Musk. I'm at C_Stroop. And I mean, yeah, you can find my writings at Religion Dispatches and Open Democracy, coming out pretty often. I'm working on a book project, but I'm not going to have a lot to say about that for a while. It's a slow burning sort of thing in the fairly early stages. So yeah, that's about it, I guess. But I'm also happy to be booked as a speaker to talk about, relevant topics to my experience. So if you're an atheist organizer out there, secular advocate listening, and you're looking for a speaker lineup that's maybe a little different, that's sort of moving on from the old atheist mentality of we put slogans on billboards. Hey, I'm your gal.
Yeah, right. How should people contact you? Through Twitter, or do you have a webpage?
I do have a webpage. It really, really needs to be updated. It's a little embarrassing at this point, but it's It's just cstroop.com. And well, one thing that I actually am proud of that's on that, I'm proud of a lot of the writing on there, the old blog that doesn't get blogged on anymore. But I'm also proud of my infographics. So there's an infographics page. I have these infographics that are a free resource, and you can download them from cstroop.com/infographics. And they include things like anti-proselytizing principles. And I have this whole infographic about, what pluralism should mean in practice. And stuff like that.
It's fantastic.
People have posted those on Twitter a lot, and a lot of people have found them thought-provoking. And maybe someday I'll make a new one. But yeah, the website's not updated often. It does have my email address on it. My email address is just first initial last name @gmail.com. I don't post it a lot on the web just because I don't want to get inundated with lots of spam or hate mail. Yeah. But it can be found by those who search,
So everything but that will be linked below. So make it super easy for everybody to just click on and find your writing and your webpage and contact information. Chrissy Stroop, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks a lot, guys, for having me. Nathan, Todd, it's been a pleasure. I really like your show. So anytime.
Excellent.
All right. That was Chrissy Stroop. Really fascinating talking with her.
Absolutely.
What did you, or what were some of your big takeaways from that?
I mean, one of the big ones is, growing up evangelical is something way more than I can even imagine. It's such an intense situation. Everything that she described. Before we got into the stuff that we thought we were going to talk about, learning more about that is really, really wild. And how it does help sort of put Christian nationalism and that sort of what they've been doing, it puts it into a context. It makes a lot more sense, right? Did it make sense to you? Was there stuff that you took away about how evangelicals sort of function politically and what we're up against as atheists?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. She was talking about her school, and how, that was so closely tied up with, patriotism and Christian belief are so closely intertwined.
Right. Was it praying allegiance to, or saying allegiance to the flag and to the Bible?
Exactly. Yeah. Which is really interesting. I think the thing that really sort of stood out, and I think we've talked about this on previous episodes too, but trying to dig into what do Christian nationalists actually care about? Do they care about abortion or gay marriage or so on? Or is it those things are just proxies for something deeper?
Yeah.
And it seems in some ways what they care about is power over other people and controlling other people.
Yeah. Totally.
Forcing people to live in the way that they want. So I think that was really valuable to have that sort of stated.
Yeah, and it's really tough to kind of disaggregate that, the difference between sort of well-intentioned, right? We think this is better for society, and this sort of controlling, manipulative aspect. And for me, one of the things that kind of a connection that I made is that, our approach to this, what we've been thinking about on the podcast, a lot of it is what are we as atheists? Once you leave the churches, what do you become? How do you shape the world? What is it like when you have this period of freedom where everything's unwritten and you kind of have to figure it out as you go? The rewriting things isn't what's a problem to them. It's not the issue in America. It's not how we're seen yet. The problem is people are leaving churches, and we kind of overlook that, right? Even when we talk about the nuns and who they are and what they want. There's a big step before that, which is people are leaving churches. They're not obeying churches anymore. They're not obeying pastors. This is a huge shift when people ignore what priests say. If you're a religious leader, you get ignored. And that's a big change, right? When you're seen as an illegitimate power, which is how we view them. Ultimately, it's a thing that unites us. Right. So when you lose that form of control in their space, right? Numbers are dwindling. Well, how do you exercise that control? How do you regain that control or maintain it? Well, you turn everything into a church. It sounds a lot like what they're trying to do, right? If you can't control people through the church, you have to find a different way to do it. So that's one of the things I started thinking about. And it's as a starting point, it feels right, doesn't it, Nathan? It sounds like there's some meat there.
Yeah, I think other people maybe have drawn kind of a similar connection, that there's sort of like the rise of Christian nationalism is not something that's just is happening like independently from the rise of the nuns. Like the two are connected, that the declining authority of the church has actually like made, these Christian nationalists like almost like redouble their efforts to impose their vision of society onto everyone else, because it's, they can see that the authority is slipping away or has slipped away already. So I think, yeah, it's a really interesting point. And then it's a question, how do you fight it then?
Yeah, and we started to get into this with the discussion of of Christian privilege, and just all of these things. Anytime you have a social movement, the beginning is usually this concept of consciousness raising, which is when you sort of put it into a dialogue, right? Like you actively think about these things that are treated as normal, realize, hey, it doesn't really suit you. It's not what you want. Let's start to imagine other ways things can be. But that idea, that recognition that things are not in a good place, is a great place to start. And we've had that discussion here, thinking about theist normativity, and how, like, wow, like it is a moment of consciousness raising where, like, we kind of hang on to it, this like old school belief, like, yeah, it says in God we trust on the money. That's a bunch of bullshit. We need to get rid of it. And there's actually a very valid reason to do it, right? Like, we don't want this norm recreating itself, where we all kind of have to, we nod, yeah, we all, in God we trust. It seems secondary, but it turns out to be very important. And in that, it's not just that it's a norm. What Chrissy adds to it is like, no, this is how they disguise their privilege. This is how they disguise their power. This idea that we're a country united by God. We are godly people. Therefore, we have more to say about this. And you can exclude atheists. And it says it on the money. In God we trust. You don't trust God, you're out. Wow, that's a lot stronger. But as you say, like, that does not give us, it's just a starting point. It's the start of a start. Not It doesn't get
Yeah,
you how to deal with it at all.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I guess part of the answer is maybe thinking about, if it is true that like what they're after is power and control, then it matters less trying to argue them out of positions about like abortion or something like that, or whatever, like, arguing about whether, a fetus is a human being or whatever, or something like that. Arguing about that isn't necessarily gonna, maybe it will for some people, like, but overall maybe that's not the way to go about it, is to argue like on the issues, almost because they're almost sort of secondary perhaps.
Right. Yeah,
um
yeah, and yeah, you touched on this earlier. Like the power's the point. It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with argument. It doesn't have anything to do with being right. It doesn't have anything to do with going to the Bible and exploring what it means and citing chapter and verse and showing that abortion is not a crime against God. It's not a sin. That exists. It's always existed. It has no bearing on what they want, which is they want to dominate our minds and bodies, right? And they're using the means of the church, and when that fails, they use the means of the government. That's what Chrissy was telling us today, and that's definitely clarifying. Definitely, in terms of like, it's not, the argument's not going to get you anywhere. It's power.
yeah, another thing, kind of related to that, is I heard this term, hypocrisy shaming, recently, and like it's a sort of idea of like, people on the more right wing, like you can sort of point out their hypocrisy or something, but there's also, and there's plenty of hypocrisy obviously, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also limits to that, because in some ways, they don't they don't
They
care.
don't care. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so like, yes, it's important to do that, but it's like that can't be the end goal, basically, or like that can't be the only sort of tool in your arsenal, I guess. So I think, yeah, that's also something to
I think we
note.
should probably do a lot of like yard work shaming. Because let me tell you, that's a big waste of time. Just doing yard work. If you can get people to think about doing more yard work and complaining less about abortion, God, wouldn't it be great if we could just get all the evangelicals to just fret about yard work all the time? Oh my God, how are their hydrangeas doing? Do they have weeds in the cracks of their patio? Oh, My goodness, there's a leaf over there that needs to be raked up.
Presumably they're paying gardeners already.
Oh God,
Yeah,
that's the way out. That's how it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Tithe and hire a gardener. Have someone
Yeah.
do, you know, and you know what it would be, Nathan. You know exactly how it would go. It would be, it would be an illegal immigrant who's saving money
Yes.
to pay for his wife's abortion, his mistress's abortion.
Yeah.
Right? They would be hiring this person. You could shame them for the hypocrisy, and they would, you know, it wouldn't matter at all. They're doing God's work. There's always an easy out.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And just one other thing to mention, and then to segue into the wrapping up, is that the bonus section where we talk with Chrissy more, I found it really fascinating because she was talking about her time teaching in Russia, and like just the changes that she was noticing there over the years, like in the early to mid 2010s, was really fascinating. So
And shades of American politics as well.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So thank you to our patrons who can enjoy that, and we encourage
Absolutely.
other people to subscribe to our Patreon to access that bonus content.
Absolutely. That's where we keep the good stuff. That's where all the gold is. People forget that. People don't know it. But if you don't have the money, you know, be sure to like and subscribe. That's a big help for us. Check out the brothers and sisters on the AU Studios network. And of course, big thanks to the audience. Thank you guys for listening. I wouldn't be here without you. We love hearing from you guys. Be sure to address all of your complaints and ideas. I guess we should play those up too. To Nath G. Alexander on the Twitters, which I think it still works. Last time I checked, it's still working. It's not on fire currently.
No.
So yeah, be sure. There'll be a link below. Anything else? Any other business we need to attend to?
No, just thanks to Chrissy, and thanks everyone for listening. And yeah, we'll see everyone next time.
Bye-bye.